Day 2 of Warwick Economics Summit 2019. I am Christopher Lim and I have the pleasure to be here with Professor Andrea Sironi, who is the Chairman of Borsa Italiana, Italy's stock exchange. He previously held the position of Rector at Bocconi University, and his research interest includes bank financial management and capital regulation. Welcome to WES and thank you for joining us, Professor.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
Starting from your speech about the challenges and opportunities of Europe's financial sector, particularly focusing on Italy's struggling banks, could you tell us what problems distinguishes the Italian financial sector from other European economies, and why is it so relevant for the eurozone economy?
Well, I think Italian banks most of them are in a good shape. They are well capitalized, they are liquid. They suffer from a problem of profitability, but I think the main issue is, of course, the fact that they have large portfolios of government bonds, Italian government bonds, in a period when the price of these bonds has gone down because of an increase in the perceived riskiness of the Italian government. So this clearly is affecting Italian banks as well.
Yeah. And why is this so relevant for the eurozone economy?
Well, it is relevant because in some way, if a bank fails or goes into trouble, we have a potential vicious circle whereby the authorities would have to step in and trying to bail this bank, which is not allowed under the current EU rules. And therefore there is a risk that a bank solvency issue gets transmitted to the other institutions. And because the financial institutions in Europe are all closely linked together, there is a potential, domino effect. Yeah. So this is clearly potentially relevant for the entire European system.
Okay. And in your answer just now, you said that Italian banks go through low profitability. Mm-hmm. And I think one of that reason could be because there's very high levels of non-performing loans in the Italian banking system.
Well, that has been the case until the last few years, and this was a result of the economic recession that in some way had so many companies defaulting on their bank loans. Okay? But I must admit that over the past 4 years, the NPL problem has been very much effectively addressed. They've been significantly reduced, securitized, sold. So it's clearly still an issue for a number of banks, but I wouldn't consider that an emergency. Okay.
And if I'm not mistaken, the current NPL rate right now is 8%. And in 2008, pre-crisis era, it was around 3%. Is it a concern that it haven't hit back to the 3% level?
Of course, what is very relevant is the trend. I mean, that went up to 11% and now it's going down quite quickly. So I think what's most relevant is the trend. Now, of course, potential risk is the fact that, as you know, Italy has been officially recorded in recession yesterday. And, potentially there is a risk that this will transmit into new defaults, corporate defaults in the future. So, that we'll have to see whether this recession is confirmed by the next data, or whether there is the possibility for a recovery.
Okay, and the European Central Bank recently communicated to each European lender the amount of capital they should hold against NPLs in their balance sheet. How do you assess this measure and what implications will it have on banks' ability to lend to the real economy?
Well, generally speaking, I am in favor of a tightening of the rules, especially for capital in banks. However, in this very specific case, I think the timing was probably not the ideal one because, banks in Italy, like in many other countries, have already strengthened their capital base. And as you say, there is the risk that if you push that a bit too much, there will be, consequences in terms of the lending activity.
Okay. And from the first question about Italy's banks, you say that most of them are in a good shape. But recently, a large regional lender in Italy has been placed into temporary administration by the ECB. There are conflicting opinions in the government on the steps to take, ranging from nationalizing it to a more conventional market solution. What are the consequences of these two approaches to the wider banking industry of the country?
Well, first of all, let me say that Carige is a bank that went through some episodes of mismanagement, if not fraud, and I think it's quite a special case, okay? Having said that, I think I would clearly be much more in favor of a market solution rather than a nationalization. The reason being, first of all, if you nationalize a bank, the empirical evidence shows that nationalized banks tend to be less efficient, tend to be less profitable, tend to be even not, say, prone to address economic cycle problems, okay? So I would be very much against that kind of solution. I would be much more in favor of some other banks potentially trying to, acquire, to purchase that bank, or some other kind of market solution.
Perfect. So thank you for your insights. We'll now move on to the next topic about Italy's recession. And the recent data released by the National Institute of Statistics depicted a quarterly decline in GDP. Bearing in mind the worsening economic conditions in important trading partners of Italy, the outlook for Italian businesses looks problematic. How are businesses reacting to this slowdown of economic activity in the country?
Well, clearly, businesses, companies, entrepreneurs are very worried about what's happening. I would say, first of all, Italian companies, especially the ones that export their products around the world, are still extremely successful. The north of the country is still performing well, okay, which is one of the richest regions in Europe, with very many successful companies. Still, what happened is that there has been a significant decrease in investments, real investments. There's been an outflow of capital. This was mostly motivated by the lack of credibility of the government, the fact that their policies were not considered credible and, consistent with the situation of the country. They are now trying to push more on consumption with policies that, to me, appear very difficult. The empirical evidence clearly shows that the way to address a high public debt is not to increase taxes, but rather to cut expenditures. And that is proving to be much more effective. And therefore, I think we're running in the wrong way.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting that you said the current government's policies are not consistent with the situation they're in. And last year, not to say major milestone, but a very important situation is the EU-Italy budget clash. And in the case of a more prolonged recession, could the expansionary budget law passed by the government help sustain domestic demand, or will it be a source of further harm?
I think the expansionary budget would not be effective for the very simple reason that it would, as it has already shown, it leads to, say, a lack of credibility in public debt management, an increase in interest expenses that almost crowds out the effect on the other side. And I think that the proper policies would be policies oriented to cutting expenditures and cutting taxes, so that this would stimulate investments and benefit the economy as a whole. And of course, indirectly, would also benefit the poor people, because at the end of the day, the ones who are mostly going to be damaged by these policies are the weakest ones.
Yeah. And moving on to Italy's business climate, specifically your role within the stock exchange.
Yes.
The start of 2019 saw the FTSE/MIB benchmark rise by 7.6%,
Yes.
which is one of the best performers among major European markets thus far. What is behind this positive performance? And in your opinion, how likely is it to continue?
Well, first of all, it's reflecting the fact that, as I mentioned already, Italy has a very large number of very successful companies that are leaders in their sector all over the world, okay? And these are mostly located in the north of the country. Many of them are actually listed on the stock exchange, so they perform well. I must also admit that, unfortunately, we had in 2018 a year that was not very successful in terms of performance. But we're very successful in attracting SMEs, getting listed in the market, and I think that is a clear point of strength of our country.
Okay, perfect. And for the last question, what are the major factors expected to affect the Italian market in 2019? And what is your forecast for the FTSE MIB index performance in the year ahead?
Well, the first question is simpler. I think that the main factor, unfortunately, will be political ones. I mean, it very much depends on what the policies will be in the future and whether there will be policies that implement structural reforms that increase the competitiveness of the country and of the Italian companies, or whether they're going to continue to be policies that are a bit, populistic, I mean, not so much in favor of the economy. The second question is more difficult. I mean, predicting where the stock market will go is, of course, very difficult. My guess is probably around 15%.
Okay.
Which would be a good result.
15% increase.
Yes.
Okay. That's perfect, and that's all the time we have today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.